Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Shalini Suryanarayan from the Department of Sociology at Hindu College, University of Delhi. Today we are going to discuss about a module, Paulo Freire, from the paper Education and Society. So students, let us see what we are going to learn in this module. This module seeks to elucidate an important perspective in the context of education that radically questions the basic assumptions of the modern educational system. Paulo Freire is a prominent educational theorist whose work lies entirely in the 20th century. In this module, you will learn about the views of this eminent theorist and activist on education. The first part of the module contains an inspirational biographical sketch of Paulo Freire. As you read, you will realize that knowing about the life of a theorist helps one appreciate the theoretical perspective with greater sensitivity and insight. The next section of the module provides an overview of Freire's thoughts on education as presented in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is his path-breaking work. Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire, a brief biography. Paulo Freire was born in Recife in Brazil in 1921. He belonged to a middle-class family. However, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, Freire's family, like many others at the time, began to experience poverty and hardship. In 1931, his family moved to the less expensive city of Jaboatão dos Guararapes to make ends meet. In October 1934, when his father died, Freire had a first-hand brush with the realities of all that impoverishment entails. His education suffered, and he started lagging behind in school. He would play with the other poor children. Freire stated later that poverty and hunger severely affected his ability to learn. I didn't understand anything because of my hunger. I wasn't dumb. It wasn't lack of interest. My social condition didn't allow me to have an education. Experience showed me once again the relationship between social class and knowledge. So because of my problems, my older brother began to work and to help us, and I began to eat more. At that time, I was in the second or third year of high school, and I always had problems. When I began to eat better, I began understanding better, and I was reading. These early experiences shaped a great deal of Freire's thinking and influenced his decision to dedicate his life to improving the lives of the poor. Even while still in high school, the prodigious Freire, surmounting all odds, started teaching grammar. At that time itself, he was intuitively drawn towards a dialogic system of education wherein one strived to understand the needs of students. After a brief stint as a lawyer, Freire ventured into a career in teaching. From 1941 to 1947, Freire was teaching Portuguese in secondary schools. As a teacher, Freire got first-hand experience of the teaching methods that were then in practice in Portugal, methods of which he had been at the receiving end as a student. He also had a close view of the operational curricula and attitudes and behaviors of teachers and students alike. The school, as we all know, is an important agency of socialization in modern society. It is an institution par excellence that teaches the necessary skills and knowledge that renders children into socially competent individuals. In the process, it also teaches children to respect authority and to follow social norms. All this demands the scrupulous exercise of authority through sanctions of various kinds. And school teachers are the manifest symbols of that authority and the executors of the same. Therefore, the school, by its very nature, is not meant to be a democratic institution. It necessarily has a visible authority structure and a rigid regimen of functioning. However, this situation gets problematic when the school exists in a polity that has not yet embraced democracy. Such was Brazil in the time of Freire. In such a situation, the school can become a hegemonic instrument that perpetuates the tyranny of military dictatorship. It is against this backdrop that the revolutionizing ideas of Paulo Freire must be understood. The emergence of a new educational paradigm. As a teacher observing the state of educational practices, Freire started devising a new paradigm of education, one that he thought would be sensitive to the needs of students. He subsequently became actively involved in adult education and workers' training. Freire was selected the first director of the Department of Cultural Extension of the University of Recife. Freire was also appointed Director of Education at SESI, which was a non-profit employers institution meant for promoting the welfare of workers and their families and improving their quality of life. Once again, in close association with the members of the working class, this time as an adult with the ability and the opportunity to contribute, Freire realized how difficult it was for them to relate to the educational concepts that were taught to them. According to Gadotti, from reading Paulo Freire, this tenure led Freire to truly understand the needs of people, and it became the starting point in the development of Freire's educational thought. During this time, Freire also participated in the movement for popular culture and argued for democracy through his lectures. His PhD thesis, which was entitled Present-Day Education in Brazil, was written in 1959, and this also presented a case for democracy and the democratization of education. Paulo Freire soon gained international recognition for his novel practices in literacy training in Brazil. In 1962, a large number of illiterate farm workers were taught to read and write in a short span of only 45 days using Freire's innovative techniques. The government approved thousands of such cultural circles to be set up all over Brazil. However, in 1964, the then government was overthrown in a coup and a military dictatorship was established. The military regime was not to take kindly to dissensions and interventions of any kind. Military dictatorship and exile. The coup of 1964, as it were, changed the course of Freire's life. Freire was penalized for his convictions. He was jailed by the new government for his anti-establishment and pro-democracy activities. In June 1964, Freire was imprisoned in Brazil for 70 days as a traitor. He was subsequently forced into political exile that lasted 15 years. After a brief stay in exile in Bolivia, he lived in Chile for 5 years, working in the Christian Democratic Agrarian Reform movement. In 1967, Freire published his first book, Education as the Practice of Freedom. In 1968, he wrote his famous Pedagogy of the Oppressed. These works brought Freire's scholarship to the gaze of the international academia. He earned critical acclaim and was offered a position as a visiting professor at Harvard. In 1969, Freire became visiting scholar at Harvard University and then moved to Geneva, Switzerland, where he was special educational advisor to the World Congress of Churches. During this time, Freire traveled worldwide, helping various governments to implement his popular educational and literacy reforms. Some of the most significant achievements of his educational techniques were in Guinea-Bissau, a West African country, where he advised the National Literacy Program. Freire's pedagogy in process, the letters to Guinea-Bissau, scripts the pedagogic journey therewith. The homecoming and laurels. In 1979, after 15 years of exile, Freire was allowed to return to Brazil. Back home, he joined the Workers' Party in Sao Paulo and from 1980 to 1986 supervised its adult literacy project. When the party came to power in 1988, Freire was appointed Minister for Education for the city of Sao Paulo. His policy interventions and innovations in literacy training as a minister were commendable indeed. In 1991, the Paulo Freire Institute was established in Sao Paulo as a center for the development of new educational theories and practices. Freire has been recognized worldwide for the profound impact of his ideas on educational practice. He was conferred with numerous awards, including honorary doctorates. Some of these are the King Balduin Prize for International Development, the Prize for Outstanding Christian Educators in 1985 with Elsa, his wife, and the UNESCO Prize for Education for Peace in 1986. In Freire, we see a scholar who also engages in political and social reform. His work illustrates the coming together of theorizing and activism. Therefore, even those who hold a disdain for armchair scholars also appreciate Paulo Freire. This is probably also one of the reasons for his immense popularity. Freire breathed his last in Sao Paulo, Brazil, on May 2, 1997. But he lives through all his work and myriad admirers. Freire's pedagogy and overview. Freire's work was mainly to do with literacy and was driven by the desire to help individuals overcome their sense of powerlessness by being able to act on their own behalf. Freire's most well-known book is Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It was first published in Portuguese in 1968 and was translated into English by Mayra Ramos and published in 1970. The book stirred popular imagination and rightfully earned its place in the discourse on education and pedagogic practices. The book is considered one of the foundational texts on critical pedagogy. It has been translated into several languages and has sold nearly 1 million copies worldwide. Anyone interested in the field of education would benefit from reading this work. In the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire proposes a pedagogic paradigm with a new relationship between teacher, student, and society. Dedicated to the underprivileged or the oppressed, and based on his own experiences while helping Brazilian adults to read and write, the work encloses a detailed Marxist class analysis in its exploration of the relationship between the teacher and the taught. Freire critiques the traditional educational paradigm that domesticates people and calls instead for a liberating education. Education for domestication tames and conditions people into resigning to their lot in life. Libertarian education, on the other hand, gives people self-confidence and a sense of being able to choose their own destiny. According to Freire, the pedagogy of the oppressed, as a humanist and libertarian pedagogy, has two distinct stages. In the first stage, the oppressed unveil the world of oppression and through praxis commit themselves to its transformation. In the second stage, in which the reality of oppression has already been transformed, this pedagogy ceases to belong only to the oppressed and becomes a pedagogy of all people in the process of permanent liberation. Throughout this and successive books, Freire has argued for a system of education that emphasizes learning as an act of culture and freedom. Freire's concept of literacy is not just literateness, of being able to read and write, but it is also to do with enabling a person to think for oneself. Literacy is also political literacy. It enables a person to recognize the hidden valuations in operation in any social context and to develop the strength to align with others to surmount these oppressive situations. Freire calls for conscientization to counter any oppressive state of affairs. Conscientization is a process by which the learner moves towards a critical awareness of his state of being and the dissonance between what things are and how they ought to be. Freire urges for moving away from what he calls the culture of silence, which is a pattern of living in which dominated individuals are so overwhelmed by their dominators that they lose the means by which to critically respond to the culture that is forced upon them by the dominant culture. Freire's pedagogy of literacy education involves the development of this critical consciousness. The formation of critical consciousness allows people to question the nature of their historical and social situation, with a view to acting as subjects in the creation of a democratic society. It must be kept in mind that Brazil was, for the main, not a democratic state at the time. However, even today, when we live in a largely democratic and free world order, closer scrutiny reveals varying degrees of oppression that renders the continuing validity of Freire's work. Being poor and in Brazil contributed in significant measure to the turn that the ideas of Paulo Freire took. His fight for democracy and for representation of people is reflected in his ideas on education. This is something that the sociology of knowledge teaches us to appreciate. Growing up in the heart of a country of the Third World, in the midst of hunger and poverty, Freire understood early in life what deprivation meant. Because Freire's own life world was constituted of poor rural families and laborers, he had a deep understanding of their lives and of the adverse impact of socio-economic deprivation on access to and availing of educational opportunity and the successful attainment of academic milestones. For education, Freire calls for a dialogic exchange between teachers and students, where both learn, both question, both reflect, and both participate in the creation of meaning. In conventional patterns of schooling, teachers engage in a monologue, which is inflicted upon the students. There is an essential asymmetry and one-sidedness in the teacher-taught relationship, where the teacher doles out knowledge to the student, who is to be appropriately grateful for this beneficence. Freire questions this paradigm and suggests a relationship of mutual give and take between the teacher and the taught. Concretely, this pedagogy begins with the teacher mingling among the community, asking questions of the people, and learning about their day-to-day lives. The teacher can do so also by compiling a list of words that are used in their daily lives most of all. These frequently used words are symbolic of the principal preoccupations around which the lives of those people are centered. Through an understanding of these conceptions, the teacher can begin to appreciate the social reality of the people and can reformulate the classroom interaction through a set of ideas that students can actually relate to. In other words, for Freire, the teacher should develop what he calls a list of generative words and themes which could lead to discussion in classes or cultural circles. By making words relevant to the lives of people, the process of conscientization could begin, in which the social construction of reality can emerge. People exteriorize their view of the world, their ways of thinking about and facing the world. It is through this that generative themes develop. Generative themes are not characteristics found per se in human individuals, but are derived through the relationship between the human and the world. The more actively people engage with investigating their themes, the more they open up to critical awareness of their reality. Themes exist in people and their relationships with the world. Themes take on much more meaning than any object or thing. It is very important that the emotions expressed by these themes are ultimately human aspirations, feelings, and objectives. In order to understand these themes, one must understand the mindsets of the individuals and the makeup of their social reality. This interest in generative themes becomes a starting point for the investigation of them, and through those to the search for a common reality, common self-awareness, and common educational practices. The investigation of these themes is thus not an exercise in psychoanalysis. Rather, it is a means to develop a basis for an educational program, looking to examine relations between students and educators. A beginning basis for this investigation should look into the links between themes, concentrating on areas of conflict and placing it in the historical context. Both education and investigation of themes must comprise communication and the shared experience of reality. education and thematic investigation come to play at different moments of the same process in the continuing hunt for the perfect educational practice. Freire offers a systematic analysis of the relationship between oppressed people and their oppressors. For Freire, being oppressed is a dehumanizing experience. Overall, Freire is concerned with the liberation of any oppressed people and the transformation of all humans, oppressed and their oppressors alike, into self-actualized, creative, empowered beings. Freire believes that in order to be able to transcend their oppression, the oppressed must first become fully aware of their condition. Further, they must come to the understanding that oppression is not a natural or inevitable condition, but an injustice that they are capable of overcoming through struggle. Through their ignorance about the nature of their condition, the oppressed tend to take on the values of the oppressors, accepting their prescriptions and oftentimes participating in the process of transmitting the oppressive order. They have to strive to recognize and acknowledge their condition and creatively visualize another world free of that oppression. It is here that the notion of praxis comes into play as a liberating process. Freire exhorts the oppressed to liberate themselves through praxis or informed, concerted, revolutionary action. Those who are oppressed have a duty towards themselves to strive to redeem themselves from their oppression. The oppressed have to free themselves and their oppressors alike. Invoking the ideas of dialectics postulated by Marx and Engels, Freire observes, and I quote, "This then is the great humanistic and historical task of the oppressed, to liberate themselves and their oppressors as well. Only power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both. When praxis comes forward as action, it becomes a means by which the oppressed can apply their latent creativity to the labor of liberation." Freire explains how oppression gets justified in society. He points out that in any society, the balance of power between the oppressor and the oppressed remains relatively stable. By virtue of habit and conditioning, the powerless in society start accepting their servitude to the point that they can in fact become afraid of freedom or asking for it. Consequently, Freire likens the oppressor to the colonizer and the oppressed to the colonized. The oppressed have to learn to fight for their freedom. As Freire always upheld, freedom is acquired by conquest, not by gift. It must be pursued constantly and responsibly. Freedom is not an ideal located outside of man, nor is it an idea which becomes a myth. It is rather the indispensable condition for the quest for human completion. This oppression has to be overcome through a mutual process between the oppressor and the oppressed. As a Marxian theorist, Freire sets forth this relationship between the oppressors and the oppressed as a dialectic, exemplifying a dynamic contradiction between the two states of being that can and must be resolved through a disruptive struggle towards synthesis. According to Freire, freedom comes as a result of praxis, informed action, when a balance between theory and practice is reached. Furthermore, according to Freire, traditional pedagogy follows what he calls the banking model, a metaphor used by Freire that suggests students are considered empty bank accounts that should remain open to deposits made by the teacher. The analogy of a child's piggy bank is useful to illustrate the nature of prevalent educational practices. According to Freire, the student in the conventional model of education is treated like a piggy bank, an inert receptacle to be filled with knowledge. He coined the phrase banking education, alluding to an educational system where learners are passive recipients of knowledge that is pre-selected for them to be deposited into their minds as if the mind were to be a bank for information. Freire launches a tirade against this banking approach to education. Freire rejects the banking approach, asserting that it results in the dehumanization of both students and teachers. Further, he argues that the banking approach entrenches oppressive attitudes and social practices. Education becomes an act of depositing. The students are the depositories and the teachers are the depositors. This type of education, according to Freire, suffers from narration sickness. The banking concept of education reinforces the power of the oppressor. Oppressors consider knowledge as a gift to be bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those who are considered ignorant. The consequence of this is an experience of education where students are socialized to accept the passive role the teachers impose on them and thereby also their ascribed social statuses. Students are taught to adapt to the world as it is and to the fragmented view of reality deposited by the teacher, who is the de facto oppressor. According to Freire, in this manner, we prevent the rise of free-thinking individuals who would strive to enhance and surpass the aspirations of those great leaders who have fought for equality and for the end of oppression. For Freire, the student has to be accorded the status of an aware co-participant in the process of knowledge acquisition. The learner has to be treated as the co-creator of knowledge. Knowledge is to be attained through a dialogic relationship between the teacher and the taught. This attempt to use education as a means of consciously shaping the person and society is called conscientization, a term first coined by Freire in this work. In contrast to this banking method, the concept of education that Freire introduces is called problem-posing education. This introduces liberating education for students. I quote Freire, "Problem-posing education breaks the vertical hierarchical patterns characteristic of banking education, and the teacher and the student become jointly responsible for a process in which both can grow. This is a reciprocal approach to education." According to Freire, this authentic approach to education must allow people to be aware of their own incompleteness and strive to be more fully human in their quest for perfection. This concept of education does not subdivide the activity of teacher from student, but on the contrary, the educator constantly reformulates his or her reflections based on the reflections of the students. They create a level of knowledge together, allowing the students to feel increasingly challenged and obliged to respond to the challenge. The techniques of the banking method are a way of teacher instruction to an alienated student. Through the problem-posing method, the oppressed have a chance to become people who are willing to fight for a just world where all live in harmony, share ideals and decisions to create a united, purposeful world. Freire concludes that any situation in which some individuals prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry is one of violence. To alienate human beings from their own decision-making is to change them into objects. He questions how oppressors can even consider themselves human while simultaneously trying to prevent others from being human. For Freire, domination and dictatorship should soon cease to exist through progressive steps taken forward by the people for themselves through the guidance of a revolutionary nucleus. That, then, is the essence of praxis, or ideology translated into purposeful action. Freire elucidates how dialogue can be used as an instrument to free the oppressed through the use of cooperation, unity, organization, and cultural synthesis. This, to Freire, is in contrast to anti-dialogics, which uses conquest, manipulation, cultural invasion, and the strategy of divide and rule. Freire argues that dialogue is a necessity for revolution. When dialogue is thwarted, it results in dehumanization and perpetuates the status quo. The oppressed have different relationships with the oppressors and the revolutionaries. Freire believes that it is necessary to obtain communion in order to achieve transformation. Freire refers to the oppressors as dominators because they dominate the oppressed instead of helping them to achieve transformation, as they are bound to conserve the existing order. The ways that the oppressors keep the oppressed in their state of oppression are through conquest, dividing, manipulation, and cultural invasion. For Freire, these are all mechanisms of anti-dialogical action. Conquest is a way of controlling the lives of others. Oppressive regimes divide people and deny unification. They manipulate them through myths and accomplish control through pacts between the dominant and dominated classes. And finally, they maintain domination through cultural invasion, wherein the beliefs of the leader are imposed on the subjects. In order to become liberated, the oppressed group must form a unity despite resistance from dominators. As Freire points out, to dominate, the dominator has no choice but to deny true praxis to the people, to deny them the right to say their own word and think their own thoughts. Revolutionaries, on the other hand, use dialogue to bring about transformation. They need cooperation, unity for liberation, organization, and cultural synthesis in order to achieve transformation. In the true pattern of Marx's discourse, this transformation has to take the following steps. People must show cooperation towards the revolutionary in order for a change. They need to unify in order to reach liberation through a communion. They must be organized and have common goals and values in sight. And finally, they must allow cultural synthesis, which is different from cultural invasion, as it is achieved through persuasion and for their own emancipation. Dialogue also denotes the refusal to passively accept one's existence. It is a creative process implying reciprocity and mutuality. It is a creative encounter between people. This means further that it must not serve for the purpose of domination or for the application of force. All humans have to accept the mortality of their existence and realize that the privileged among them have no special attributes or powers as such other than those conferred by their social positions. This knowledge of the universality of the human situation becomes the common ground for dialogue. Education is thus to be viewed as a dialogue between people trying to learn together in their pursuit of perfection. It leads both the teacher and the taught to learn more than they already know. True dialogue has to be based upon critical thinking, and this critical thinking should evolve by the interaction between the various participants in the dialogue. Through dialogue, people communicate mutually, and this communication is therefore an absolute imperative. According to Freire, numerous political and educational policies and plans have failed because of over-reliance on one-sided views and lack of reciprocal communication. Humans exist in a world that is constantly changing and altering. It is a world that we are aware of. People have an awareness of themselves as of their surroundings. For the reason that humans are conscious beings, a relationship derives between their own freedom of action and the constraints that limit it. Freire calls these as limit situations. We have seen all through that Freire has developed some terms, utilizing them as concepts that are uniquely his. The use of the term limit situation with regard to the dimensions of human praxis is one such terminological usage. Limit situations are not necessarily hopeless or insurmountable, but they act as fetters that need to be broken. It is important to recognize one's potential as a human being. Only humans have the power to create knowledge. Humans not only produce material goods, tangible objects and commodities, but also social ideas, themes, and concepts. As humans separate themselves from their own activities, execute their own decisions, and test their relationships with others and the world, humans start overcoming the situations which seem to limit them. In this way, with a radical pedagogic paradigm, Freire charts the course of transformation from an exploitative social order to an egalitarian one. Paulo Freire and evaluation. Freire has used dichotomies that represent opposite characteristics and yet together constitute a unity. Some of Freire's dichotomies include the student-teacher, oppressed-oppressor, colonizer-colonized, and the dialogics-anti-dialogics dichotomy. This is by far one of the best illustrations of Marx's dialectic method in application. While for Marx and Engels, the dialectic operates in the infrastructure, Freire's pedagogic discourse shows how the same configuration can be seen in the domain of the superstructure, and indeed, the emergence of revolutionary consciousness within the superstructure can also effect far-reaching social transformations. The entire work is a brilliant rendering and carrying forward of the methodological teachings of Karl Marx. The notion of praxis as a dynamic workable construct has been truly energized by Freire. It is through praxis that when the oppressed unveil the world of oppression, they commit themselves to conquering it in their quest for an egalitarian social order. As long as there is a struggle for more humane educational practices, for deeper insights into dynamics of power and oppression, and the desire of people to construct their own realities exists, the praxis espoused by Freire justly shows a way towards liberation, both in thought and deed. So students, let us summarize what we have learned in this module. Paulo Freire's life is an inspiring illustration of how great people often turn adversity into an opportunity. We saw that as an educationist, Freire has espoused the cause of a learner-centered educational paradigm. It is true that even in present times, the models of schooling that are followed, as well as the curricula, have little relevance to the mass of the people. And those who successfully delve through this crucible are acknowledged in society. Freire's ideas of replacing a regressive pedagogy marked by oppressive authority of the pedagogue with a more egalitarian, liberating system of education are therefore necessitated even today. The progressive educational ventures that Freire spearheaded still remain worthy of emulating. Living in a democracy as we do, if we look at Freire, momentarily setting aside his revolutionary agenda, we can appreciate the full worth of Freire's pedagogic thought. Even divested of their revolutionary underpinnings, Freire's pedagogic exercises are relevant for bringing the marginalized into the fold of the mainstream educational systems and practices. Thank you.